Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Our guest tonight is Dr. Dale Pollard, former, Lutheran, Baptist, Assembly of God, Presbyterian. The Lord's been bringing him on a long journey, all in following our Lord Jesus Christ. But of course, he's here tonight to talk about his journey home. And so, Dr. Pollard, it's great to have you, Dale, on the program. Thank you for coming this long way.
Glad to be here.
Long way from the West Coast.
Yeah. Still good coffee, though.
Yeah, that's right. Well, good to have you on the program. Before we jump into it, you have a website, eighthDayCommunity.org, right? So as people are hearing your story, if they want to find out more about not only yourself, but what you do, that's a good place to go?
Yeah, great place. Great place to go.
All right, okay. We'll probably get back to that later. But
sure.
First thing I always do is get out of the way as soon as I can to help the folk understand from the beginning how the Lord was reaching you as a young man to come home to the church.
Well, I grew up in Seattle. I'm a Boeing brat, meaning my dad worked and retired for Boeing, so my grandparents, uncles, aunts, friends all joined the Lazy Bee, as we call it, up in Seattle. But I was spared the Lazy Bee, and that's part of my journey. So as a young kid, my dad worked, and I'm very proud to be connected with this. My dad worked for Boeing in aerospace, engineer, and he worked on the Saturn V booster rocket.
Really?
Yeah, in the Apollo program. And so we moved from Seattle as a young kid down to Huntsville, Alabama. That's where, because Redstone Arsenal down there, they tested the rocket. That's 4 years. And that's during the civil rights movement. So a little white kid down to Alabama was kind of a shock, but good memories.
Yeah.
And then from there, back up to Seattle for a year. And then from there down to Cocoa Beach, Florida, Cape Canaveral, and just wander.
So you were in the view of all the stuff I was watching on TV.
Yeah.
Well, that's exciting as a young man to see all that.
Oh, it was great. It was great. It's so great. I made sure that I was married on July 20th, 1985. July 20th, 1969 was the first moon landing, right?
Yeah.
So make sure you have that is your anniversary. It's a double impact.
It still amazes me that when your dad was doing all that, they were mainly doing it with slide rules.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's something our young people can't connect to today with everything computerized, but then it was slide rules. I mean,
slide rules, computers that were very rudimentary. Yeah, it's amazing.
Actually drawing things on paper,
Amazing how that works.
That's right. With all that traveling, was there a spiritual side?
Well, that was tough. I grew up in Missouri Synod Lutheran, and remember as a young kid in Huntsville, we were part of a small church that was Missouri Synod. I remember some pretty fond times there, small church, but it was tough to connect.
Yeah.
Seattle and all that moving around. My mom was Missouri Synod. She really ran the spiritual side of the family. My dad's higher power was engineering. Wasn't mine. I'm just making a joke. He's now Catholic, by the way.
No, but I understand that because I have an engineering background too. I mean, it's so all-engrossing.
Yeah.
Even as he's in a perspective of looking at the world and relationships.
It becomes your world. Anyway, so I have fond memories of that, but moving around, and in high school it became too difficult for my mom to drag us, my brother and I and my sister, to church. Dad didn't want to do that, so we quit. We quit church and became very accomplished pagans. I did that pretty well. And just high school, no spiritual side. Although I have to say that the experience that my mom gave us, or the church gave us, helped. I think it helped me not get into more trouble than I did, because I had some recollection that there was right and wrong and 10 Commandments and you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. There wasn't a whole lot of ought to do these. I think one of the things that was not helpful for me growing up was not having, my dad worked and worked and worked and worked. He was gone a lot. He went from aerospace to Boeing Defense. And so he was traveling a lot. He was traveling to Air Force bases and just gone a lot. So I didn't have a lot of, the fatherly mentoring that
Yeah.
was
A
crucial.
lot of dad time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
some good memories of that when he was home, but not a lot. During those formative years when you're really trying to form yourself as a man.
Yeah.
Not having that is a little bit difficult. So
When you do look back, so the spiritual was fleeting because you were traveling a lot.
Mm-hmm.
For you as an individual, was there a cognitive, was there prayer? Was there a reality of a sense of God? Well, or was it just not one of those categories that came up a lot in your private life?
I think high school more like that. But I remember you just got a memory going.
Yeah.
I remember in Alabama, I would watch as a young kid. I don't know why I watched this program. It was a Sunday morning program. It had to do with real life stories of, I don't even know what it's called, real life stories of Christians and their life and how they touched the world. Early morning, and I don't know why I wasn't watching cartoons. Maybe I was. I just happened to be on this one program, but I remember watching this one show about this couple, especially this guy who was involved. He was a Christian, but not pastor or anything, just a layperson, but involved heavily in people's lives, especially young people's lives. Mm. And what I recall, of course I don't know if it's the full story because it's a long time ago, is this friend, this young guy that he befriended, and it was kind of a tragic story, wound up committing suicide, hanging himself. I remember watching this. And I don't know how the show ended, but I remember thinking, I'm going to do this. Not suicide,
Yeah.
but I'm going to be helping people in crisis. Of course, that was right after I was going to be a missionary in Africa and et cetera, but it touched me in a way that, it's a memory just implanted in the brain and
Amazing
the
the way the Lord uses things throughout our life.
Yeah, so I remember watching it go, I don't think I wanted to do that, but I thought that that's what I'm probably going to do. And it proved true. I plunge into people's lives, but that's the rest of the story.
That's right.
Yeah.
But at the time we've got you in your journey, your high school faith is the church.
My higher power at that time was the Seattle Seahawks. Well, early on it was the Baltimore Colts. So it was staying home watching football with my brother, and that was it.
Okay.
And just being goofy, just goofy high school guys playing sports and just being goofy. But nothing transcendent. Nothing really in depth.
And it wasn't, it still amazes me, having been pretty much a believer all my life. I can't even imagine what life is like to not believe in God. But a lot of people, probably just like yourself, it just wasn't a category that came up. Just too many other things filling your life.
Well, yeah, too many things immediate, right? I did not believe in God, but Jesus didn't come up a whole lot.
Yeah.
I remember, of course, portraits of the white Jesus staring off into space, looking perfect. I remember that Jesus, and he wasn't involved in my life, which was too bad, which was really bad, actually.
Yeah.
But early on, that seed helped. The seed planted early on in my life.
Catholic Church at all? Any thoughts about that as a young man? Even the
I didn't think
reality?
about much as a young man.
Okay, all right. So
I didn't think, and certainly not the Catholic Church.
Okay. But you weren't on the trajectory to follow in the footsteps of your father then? In terms of engineering,
My brain doesn't work that
aerospace?
way. I'm more artist, more designer. So I knew I couldn't do engineering. I was good at math, but slide rules confused me. But I drew a lot. I was artistic. That was the stuff that really I was drawn to beauty, as a young guy. I remember that. Yeah, so I was drawn to beauty, and that was part of the story. Part of the story about going into the faith. So high school, happened. Regular high school, and then graduation. Now, what do you do in life? Well, I guess you go to college. So I went to community college for a while. Still nothing stirring, except for the beginning stirrings of being lonely. And something, all of a sudden after high school, you got to start thinking about life. So I started thinking about life, thinking, I think I'm alone out here. And I don't know, that was part of the Spirit's awakening, maybe stirring up those things that were planted deep in the heart. So eventually, through missionary dating, we know what missionary dating is about, in Tacoma, Washington, this young girl I liked her a lot, but the only place we went was church. I didn't care, let's go to church. It was a small Baptist church, fundamentalist, really small, maybe 100 folks. So we went there, and I started listening, and people were just totally friendly. Just welcoming. Potlucks were great. And I like potlucks. I like banqueting, part of the story. So I became more aware of Jesus. You do it in a Baptist church because that's what you hear.
Yeah.
And if you're only a church of 100, well, here comes this young pagan guy, and we're going to get him. We're going to get him saved. And so that's what happened.
Yeah, just for the audience that isn't familiar with the Baptist church, usually every Sunday there's a little bit of an altar call.
There's a big altar call.
Depending on the Baptist church, it could be an overt altar call, right?
Yeah.
Every single Sunday. And if you're the one obviously pagan kid, and that pastor is thinking every week there's old.
They don't turn to me. Am I supposed to do something here? So eventually I talked to the pastor, and it's that loneliness that came creeping in, and so the word started filtering in, and I met with him, and sinner's prayer, accepted Jesus into my heart, and was baptized. That was a pretty embarrassing situation in a small Baptist church. You put the white gown on, and the baptistry is up above the altar in the back, and you say something, testimony, and get dunked, and there you go. Yeah. And it worked. I was really converted. Jesus became real. I went from Tacoma, then got, my dad said, hey, I got some money. I want to send you and your brother and sister to college. So pick a college. So Western Washington University in Bellingham, where I live now. Sight unseen, I went up there and said, yeah, I'm going to go to college. And met my roommate, who I didn't see. Now you do the whole Facebook roommate thing, and you can match DNA and microchips, and you're all of a sudden compatible. But he was Christian, just an eclectic. We were total opposite guys. But we were roommates for 2 years. He's a great guy. Anyway, I came up. I'm a Christian. I'm going to a secular college. If I have to be martyred, I'll be martyred. That's what you do as a Christian. So then I saw this poster, Campus Crusade for Christ. I said, oh, okay, so Crusade is here. Well, good. I'm not the only Christian on campus. So I plunged into their meetings, but one thing that was interesting, I went to Crusade, and at that time it was a pretty big group. There was another group I'll talk about later that was huge. But when I went to Crusade, the first impression, first impressions are very important. Like here at the Coming Home Network, total hospitality, total welcome. That's God's voice, right? You feel part of the family. But I went there, it's no fault of them. Maybe it's just a bad night. But I didn't feel welcome. I was a newcomer, not knowing anything, and I just needed to be around people who acknowledged that I was a Christian, but didn't feel a real welcome. But I stick with the group for about a year, and then some other of my suite mates in the dorm were part of this larger group, pretty large, 400 or 500 kids. Chi Alpha Assembly of God group called Campus Christian Fellowship, still going on, still same director after all these years. And charismatic, the tail end of the Jesus movement. And I plunged into that life. And it was great as a college kid. It was a beginning step of community, of discipleship, of street drama, of camps, of persecution. We were kicked off campus for a while. But it just made the group larger. They're back on campus, of course. So that became the big part of my life. And after graduation from college, I then interned with that group, along with my wife, Diane, who wasn't my wife at that time. And after you interned, if there was opportunities around the country to start other groups, Chi Alpha groups, then you could go as a missionary to those places. And so we were picked, again, not married, as a team to go down to Kearney, Nebraska, right on I-80, to start a group and be on staff with the Assembly of God Church and see how it goes. So it's an interesting story. So we actually moved together in a U-Haul truck, towing her VW in the back, like the Beverly Hillbillies. We went down to Nebraska, became campus pastors with Chi Alpha, and on staff with the Assembly of God Church, which is a bit problematic because the church we were part of in Bellingham, which is still going, Hillcrest Chapel, was very un-AG-like. It was interdenominational in outlook, but this was very Assembly of God, and so we had to adjust. Yeah. And after a couple of years there, but very interesting. So there was a Baptist campus pastor who really was a great guy, who actually believed in tongues. We thought that was great. And the mainline denominations, Catholic, Methodist, etc., all campus pastors had a monthly meeting. And these guys were great. They were hospitable towards us, but they would talk about things I had no clue about. I wasn't.
You mean theology-wise?
Theology-wise.
Yeah,
I had no. Yeah. The Newman Center guy would talk about that, and I go, oh, that's interesting. What are you talking about? Lutheran guy would talk about that, and all the, bantering and in good faith. So Diane and I got engaged. That was another story. I was going to be single the rest of my life. That's just what you do. St. Paul said, well, if you don't want to, if you're not married, which is a vocation, then you kind of freed up. So I wasn't going to marry, but the Holy Spirit, many other things, and the whole church had other things in mind. So, and that's a whole book in itself, how this knucklehead finally recognized that this woman was wonderful. I mean, the whole church knew that, and they were trying to get that through to me. We became engaged to a standing ovation with the church. We decided that, yes, we need to go back to Seattle. I want to go to Vancouver, to Regent College. And if I'm going to be in pastoral ministry, need to know something. But we need to get married first. So we moved back, got married, and then we started our life together.
I mean, the simple thing, just to make sure,
Sure.
is that at this point, theology's out there somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's about following Jesus Christ.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, that really is what you're saying, going in all these different places, even getting married, all of this is about following Him.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I knew that I was pretty good at counseling. And again, going back to the childhood memory. Somehow campus ministry wasn't a good mix for me. Because, I would be involved in people's lives, helping counsel. I'd be down at Buffalo County Jail, helping guys in the jail. And I didn't really like being on campus. So the clue was, sounds like it's not for you. And for sure, it wasn't. So I went back, got married, started at Regent College part-time, just scratching out a living. And then in summers, going up to Alaska, being a tour bus director.
And Regent College is a non-denominational?
Correct, up in Vancouver, BC.
Interdenominational, evangelical, very committed to Scripture and our Lord Jesus. And,
started by J.I. Packer and Dr. Houston. It was interesting, Dr. Houston really, Henry Nouwen was a big part of the big campus group in Bellingham. Again, we talked a little bit beforehand. Henry Nouwen was great, but we didn't connect that maybe his Catholicism helped inform his writing. So I knew a little bit about, Catholic spirituality, imitation of Christ. I knew that I was drawn to contemplative, meditative, social action. So up to Regent College, Dr. Houston, good Anglican that he is. You take a course on prayer from him, well, all of a sudden you're introduced to Ladder of Divine Ascent, John Climacus, the Eastern Fathers. And it was a whole world opened up that I knew nothing about. So I think that was really not a seed. It was a starter plant in the heart, which I think started flourishing. So up in Alaska, a couple summers, earning money for seminary and driving the great whites, I used to call them, the coaches in the Yukon, and based out of Fairbanks, Alaska. It was a great time. It was a great time listening to stories. Listening to stories of people who want to tell their story. And oftentimes, these people, this is their 50th state. This is the last big vacation of their life. And I would just listen to their stories. Of course, I do the tour bus thing, but their stories were remarkable. Just really remarkable stories. So back, involved in community churches and church starts, church endings. I was involved in a lot of different churches. Then back to Hillcrest Chapel, kind of our mothership, which wasn't initially a very friendly place to be. Again, it was kind of like being in crusade, but where do we go?
Yeah.
So we came back kind of as strangers, but we wanted to plunge in. And so we did, and eventually started a counseling ministry with some other guys. I was working at a treatment center, drug and alcohol treatment center, working with kids, working with adults, working with families, and some other Christians were involved with that. And we started a counseling ministry in the county called Bridging, and became itinerant counselors. We would go to Assembly of God, to Baptist. We were ecumenical. And at that time, that was a while ago, there wasn't a whole lot of counseling Christian-wise. Now, there's a lot. And eventually I became director of that, and then the church, Hillcrest Chapel, asked me to come on and bring Bridging in, and then start community service, kind of like Catholic community services. Mm-hmm. And that's how a big part of my journey really started taking off.
In connection with the other.
Yeah.
And you said we, so your wife's with you on all this,
Mm-hmm.
very much part of this ministry.
Yeah.
Again, it's Christ-centered,
Yeah.
ecumenical, but...
it's not, it's Protestant.
Right.
It's evangelical Protestant, but not really ecumenical.
But when I mean ecumenical, what I meant was, it's about Jesus, doesn't matter what church you're in.
Exactly.
It's just about Christ and bringing a person to a deeper relationship with Christ,
Right.
and all the other issues that involves it, like whether it's getting into drugs or alcohol, it's finding a relationship with Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the emphasis. Now, had you gotten your DMin yet in spiritual? That's coming.
That's coming.
Okay, all right. Why don't we pause there?
Okay.
Let's pause there, because it sounds like now all of a sudden you're going to start becoming a little more aware of maybe this other.
Lots more.
Okay, let's pause there and come back, and then we'll pick you up on that. All right, Dale, thanks a lot. See you in a bit. Welcome back to the Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Dr. Dale Pollard, and I've cut you off right in the middle of
DMin land.
You're doing community counseling, which is getting you in connection, kind of non-denominational, helping people in the name of our Lord. It is really what you and your wife are both doing. But of course now you're working with a variety of traditions.
Yeah.
And doing that very thing.
So that's when things started. I'm on staff of the church now, full-time, learning what church politics are all about and not liking that very much. But that's just kind of way.
Which denomination was that?
Assembly of God.
Okay, still
Yeah,
aging.
and I became licensed with the assemblies. Of course, one of their distinctives is, Azusa Street, initial physical evidence of the infilling of the Holy Spirit is speaking in tongues, which was part of my experience. But that became a wrestling point later on. So we're helping people. We're starting groups. We're starting 12-step groups. Expanding the counseling ministry. Part of that was there was a big human services program up at Western Washington University. And kids are connected, so I brought them and other MSW, Master of Social Work interns, into my own internship, as well as lay people. That became a big part of my life there at the church. And part of that, training people, again, this is Regent College up in Vancouver. Their influence is contemplative, meditative. Well, it's a spiritual formation of life. But in any counseling, in any group, you're dealing with loss and grief. It's about loss. Something is lost. And so in the tradition I was in, I couldn't find adequate answers to loss. I was searching for them. What about suffering? What about unexplained suffering? It's not always Romans 8:28 when somebody is grieving the loss. Yeah. It doesn't help. So that plunged me pretty almost instantly into classics, in the classics of the faith, Desert Fathers, the Eastern Church, Orthodox Church, around what are ultimate answers? And how does my tradition address those? Well, I found out it didn't. It didn't address them adequately. It put a Band-Aid on things, which didn't help many people. So
I was going to say this, sometimes a simple gospel, you have to have faith in Jesus. My life's a mess. God, put your faith in Jesus. Well, yes, but that isn't the answer to suffering, or even if there's a value to suffering. Is there a purpose behind the suffering? All these other issues. I remember as a pastor one time when a wife died of cancer, and everyone said, well, if she had enough faith, it wouldn't happen. I mean, it was a disaster. The husband left the faith completely because of this whole inadequacy to deal with the issue of suffering and loss.
So couple that with a personal journey. So early on in marriage, we found out we were infertile. And that can throw you for a big loop. And it did. It did. As a matter of fact, we went, again, this is one of the churches that we were counseling out of. The pastor wanted us to come to a prayer and healing time. I said, sure, okay, we'll come to it. So we went, and it was okay. And afterwards he said, well, I think this is going to be it. God's healing you. But think about your lack of faith. And I just stopped him. I said, look, dude, I don't buy that. I don't care about it. God's got something in this suffering for us. And that was, he what? And so, soon after he was booted out of the church. But that's another story.
Yeah.
But I knew God had something for this. But the church had a hard time directing. At this time, I had started a group called Lamentation, Loss and Grief Group, different than what I have now, just a different content. But knowing that there's got to be something in people's stories to be listened to, that most of grieving is having someone listen, like you're listening now, to my story of grief. And maybe my story, the story of the person who died, or the dream that died. Just let me talk. And you can pray somewhere else, in silence. Don't talk. That was a big part of how I trained my interns. Just don't talk when somebody's like this. And so I was the guy on staff, right? People would come and their grief stories would be pouring out. And so started a class, and then our personal journey, right? Around, well, who's going to address our grief? I remember mowing my lawn one time, and I hate mowing. I hate it. I detest it. But I was mowing one day, thinking, if and when, this is after infertility, that discovery, when I have a loss, how is the church going to help me and my family? I'm helping lots of other people, but how are they going to help me? Well, back up a little bit. So our infertility. So we prayed for 5 years. What does God have for us? Adoption, children in our life in some other way. And in prayer, my wife led the way, as a lot of wives do, and sensed that we needed to adopt internationally. So big part of our story is adoption. And international adoption. So our first daughter, Amy, who's now at St. Martin's College, next to St. Martin's Abbey, where I'm an oblate now, is from China. And so this is early on in Chinese adoption. We just felt compelled to go overseas. So we went to China for a couple of weeks. Got a baby, came back. We got a big souvenir from China. And so she obviously was part of our life. And we wanted to go back to China to get sister number 2. And we wanted to have girls because they were the least in China. They're thrown away, they're abandoned, as Amy was, my oldest, because that's what God calls us to. He calls us to help on the street. That's that childhood memory. You got to help. Yeah. You got to be engaged. So that was huge and wonderful, and we wanted to go back to China. But at that time, China, they changed rules like this. We couldn't go back. But the adoption agency we were working with, you could be in 2 programs at once in case something changed. So we were in Russia too. So it changed, just like that. Oh, big grief, big sorrow. But now, Lord, I was a little bit ahead of my wife in this one because she was devastated. We couldn't go back. We thought we couldn't adopt again. Russia. We got to go to Russia. So we went to Russia. I got our second daughter, Anna, from just north of Vladivostok, and we were in Russia for a month. Had to fly from Vladivostok to Moscow to get her visa. We were in Moscow for a week, just hanging out, visiting the Kremlin, and you do that when you're hanging out. So that story of adoption, as Chesterton says, overwhelms that sorrow becomes small and special. His words, and I think it was an orthodoxy or everlasting man, that Christianity satisfies supremely in this, that joy becomes overwhelming and sorrow special and small. And I knew he was Catholic. He's one of those guys that can say in a sentence what most people can't say in volumes. So then, the redemptive suffering, and then reading and being plunged into into what the world is around suffering. And then, so we're advocates for adoption. Obviously, we appreciate the Catholic stance on gay marriage, especially on abortion. We're part of that, right to life, and adoption stories, and we're heavily involved with that. And then my mom died unexpectedly 13 years ago. She was a hub, as most moms are hubs. And that was devastating for the family. Devastating. And devastating for me. I was very close to her. And so it was chaos. The grief story of how your body reacts, and that, mowing the lawn came true when that suffering happened. No fault of their own. They just didn't know how to react. The staff of the church was befuddled. They didn't know how to attend to my grief. And that was maybe the big part of the story that launched us in a different direction. Who's going to address our grief? Who will understand what we're going through? Oh, people, folks who just have to say something because they're uncomfortable not saying anything, but once they say it, they're comfortable and they can go home and you can be mad at them. Well, that's what was happening. So I was digging through Scripture. What's going to happen? Lord, I'm drying up here. Read the Psalms. Okay, I'm reading the Psalms. Well, they all kind of end happy except for a couple of baby bashing ones, and that's just his anger coming through. But then I came to Psalm 88, the dark psalm. And that's the only one that comforted me. Because there I saw that God understood my suffering. He understands it. It doesn't end happy. It's a darkness. Not a dark night of the soul. That's a different deal. But it's just it's who's going to understand my suffering? That was a big, then all of a sudden, the trajectory was kind of like this towards the church. Kind of went whoosh, pretty quickly. So reading things and just, okay, and then, I'm developing remembrance services that look very Lutheran and kind of Catholic, actually. not even knowing it, I'm getting into trouble because this is an Assembly of God church. Well, we're figuring out pretty quickly that, our life is not going to be with the Assemblies of God. Now I'm ordained with the Assemblies of God. Very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. I just thought I needed to do it. So life goes on. I'm on staff for a long time. And Ray Bakke comes, Ray Bakke from Bakke Graduate University, he got his famous years, urban Christian, theology as big as a city, doing his gig in Chicago, comes, moves back to Whatcom County, just where I'm at, because he's from the logging part of Whatcom County, and he's in the church. I know who he is, because I'm into Christian community development, I'm into prison ministry, I'm into all this stuff. He says, got a seminary. And here's the D-min. You want to be part of that? Yeah. Okay. So I just knew that we had to do something because life was coming to an end at this church. Plunged into transformational inner city work, community development, but my bent was spiritual formation. And so I kind of tailored things around loss and grief, palliative care, what it means to suffer. I should probably have been going to a Catholic seminary, but it was great. It was great. So I got my doctorate of ministry, and then shortly after that, I left the church. After the pastor that was there a long time was asked to leave. That was very hurtful. Church was in chaos. We needed to leave. So I had some teaching gigs at a local Christian college, in tech college, in the seminary that I graduated from. And we left the church, Assembly of God. I let my ordination lapse because I didn't believe that anymore. I needed to be a man of honor. I didn't believe that. We developed was part of a community church, an inner city community development church for a while. Then Presbyterian, and then it happened. So the pastor, who was great preacher at the Presbyterian church, great friend, was on sabbatical in Italy, Christmas. We didn't like anybody else preaching there. We wanted to go Christmas Eve somewhere. And my wife, in her prayerfulness, said, well, hey, let's go to Sacred Heart, which is just up from the church I was on staff with. I used to go walk with guys and go in the church when it was open and pray. Just love the beauty. Let's go to Children's Mass, Christmas Eve. Oh, okay. Yeah, I've never been to Mass. We thought it was all going to be in Latin. We wouldn't understand anything, but who cares? It's a pretty church. So we went, and of course it was all in Latin. It was kids, chaos everywhere, kids in the nativity thing, being cute, Christmas carols, didn't even know who the pastor was or the priest. And we were up in the balcony because we thought we came early, but we didn't, and it was crowded. And we came out of that stunned. I could not get my eye off the crucifix in front. We didn't even know. We knew who Mary was. We didn't know who this guy was. Is that Paul? Who is this guy? I think it's got to be Joseph. Yeah, it's got to be Joseph but we knew nothing, which is interesting. I knew some of the Desert Fathers and that, but didn't know anything. But Diane and I came out of there stunned. Yikes. What's God doing? We were so stunned we didn't even go back for 2 weeks, praying. Does God want us to be Catholic? What's going on here? Our kids are going, huh? What do you mean? So we said, well, okay, kids, our teenagers, we're going to go to Mass. We're going to make ourselves known, which is very unusual. We're going to go to coffee hour. We're going to make ourselves known because this is the last straw. We're to a point of we're not going to go to church anymore, or very seldom, because I knew everybody in the county, and nothing was feeding us. We just decided, why do we go to church? To hear somebody's opinion about a commentary that they read? Is that all there is? We've kind of heard this stuff before. We're getting dry. Then it happened. So we went back. We didn't know anything. We knew nothing. When to kneel, when to stand up, what they're doing, this, that, and the other thing. Went to coffee hour. Let's meet some people. So we met one of the people on staff. She's wonderful. She runs RCIA. We met the priest at that time. Young guy, charismatic. great pastor. We said, okay, let's keep going. Let's keep going and see what happens, because this is kind of cool. But we needed to read. And so we were telling her story, or our story to her when we first met this person who's in charge of liturgy. She goes, "Wow, your story sounds like Scott Hahn a little bit. Do you know Scott Hahn?" "No." "Who's he?" We knew nothing. And so she gave us a bunch of CDs to listen to this. Oh, I said, oh, God. It's, wow, this is something. So we need to learn more. So our first book that we bought was Catholicism for Dummies.
Yep.
At Barnes & Noble by two Jesuit
Father
people.
Trujillo.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
And it's great. The basics, right? Oh, that's why they do that. Oh, look at that. And backing up a little bit, my spiritual formation studies, I knew that we didn't get Mary in the Protestant faith. Mary was somebody special. I didn't know how special. But I used to say that a lot, which got me in trouble. We don't get Mary, do we? We don't pay attention to her. She's not just a random womb. She won the lottery to be the mother of God. I mean, she was somehow.
We kind of treat her that way as non-Catholics, but we didn't know really what to do with her.
Didn't know.
Yeah.
Didn't know. Part of the trajectory, right? So we're plunging in, and we're just learning. We're just gathering books. Scott Hahn, oh yeah, and this, oh yeah, that one, and what? You got to be kidding! So, and then we plunged into RCIA, and we just told the girls, looks like Mom and Dad are going to become Catholic. What? You don't have to. That's your journeys, but you're going to have to come to church. If you're eating my food, you got to come to church with me, right? So they came. And God was touching them too, just touching them. Because they were injured before. The leaving of the former church was very difficult. My mom's death, very difficult for them. They wanted some answers too, some answers that were meaningful. So RCIA, we were there as a family for the 9 months, and we just kept going and reading. We had the priest over for 4 hours at our house, and he was explaining things. Former intern of mine, who's now becoming a nun. She's an artist. Came over. She became Catholic. So it was pretty evident that God was leading us into the church. Unbelievable. Which made a lot of people uncomfortable. But oh well, be uncomfortable. This is what God's doing with us. So RCIA, we decided as a family, yes, God's moving us into the church, and we're fresh. Just a year and a half ago, I became Catholic together at an Easter Vigil.
Often when, especially with your background, Lutheran, Baptist, Assembly of God, a little bit of Presbyterian, there's often doctrines that stand in the way or are barriers you have to step over. But it does seem like this issue of suffering was really the drawing thread all the way through this. So as you entered the church, what aspect of Catholic teaching on suffering was particularly fulfilling for you that drew you to the church?
That's a good question. I'm reminded of a vision that I had before coming into the church. This is at a charismatic kind of healing ministry called Living Waters. There's a conference in just outside of Calgary. And it was way charismatic. I mean, it was so charismatic I became uncomfortable with charismatic. But during that time, I had an unexpected vision of the cross. Powerful vision of Jesus on the cross. I could smell things, I could feel, it was just incredible. But I think it was Jesus on the cross that really spoke to me and spoke to my family. Jesus on the cross, because in Protestant churches you see a cross. But he's not there. He's just not there. It's almost like he's been excluded from the proceedings. Learn a lot about him. But seeing Jesus on the cross meant in the heart, for sure, that he understood suffering. So it was the crucifix, it was him on the cross, and what it meant for him to suffer for us that started being driven home. I heard it before, but I had to visualize it. And so I visualized that, and it made more and more sense and more depth in our journeys.
Well, Paul makes that statement that he will preach Christ crucified,
Yeah,
not just resurrected,
right.
Christ crucified. And I'm wondering, Dale, also this idea that I certainly don't want to point fingers at our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. I don't want to be negative there at all. That's not the point. But often the answer there to suffering was there's a lack of faith, a lack of trust. This suffering has to be put away, move on. Where's your joy? Whereas the Catholic perspective is in the midst of this suffering might be exactly where God wants you to be so you can be drawn closer to Him.
Mm-hmm.
In the midst of that suffering.
It's redemptive.
There's something there about that stage in your life that suffering has a purpose, a goal for you. There wasn't much in the non-Catholic literature that dealt with that. When you were in your D-Min program, was that some of what you're also getting introduced to?
Not by the instructors, but by my own inquiry, basically, being drawn into that. And it was, there's some answers for it, but somehow in the Catholic tradition, there's purpose, but there's a listening presence that God gives us. It's Psalm 88 for everybody. God knows you're suffering. I mean, really knows it. And that's all you need to know. There's no answers why sometimes, most times. But that God is present. See, Jesus is present with your suffering. And that was somehow a disconnect in my Protestant life. Jesus identified with it, but if he's excluded from the proceedings, then he's just kind of like a Skyping partner. He's not there with you.
Yeah. I'm also thinking of that verse in Colossians 1:24 where Paul says he completes this suffering.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have a category for that before. What to do with that verse. Now we understand this sharing, the mystery of that. I mean, there's a mystery in that, of how we share in the suffering of Christ. I've got an email here. Let's see if we can get one in the time. Dylan from Washington. My family and I converted a few years ago. And after getting used to the differences in liturgy and deepening our understanding of Catholic doctrine, we are at a point where we want to grow in our spirituality. What sort of places should we look to develop our understanding of Catholic spirituality and devotion? We come from an eclectic background like you or I came from. How do you understand what Catholic spirituality is, and where do you go to make sure you're being drawn correctly?
One thing I was drawn to was the Benedictine order and also the Ignatian spirituality. That was early on. So one of my ministries is called Prodigal Men's Ministry. There's 12 steps woven in and out. But, there's some Benedictine spirituality and Jesuit spirituality. So I would pick up maybe the Order of St. Benedict and the spiritual exercises. Go to the classics, go to the websites, they're prolific, and begin to plunge into some of these folks that have been doing this for a long time. I was always attracted to Benedictine spirituality. A long time before I became Catholic, wanted to become an oblate, which I did just this last March. So some of the disciplines of the faith, I think that I would start there, for sure.
I remember when I was on my own journey, being introduced to Catholic spirituality. I remember being introduced to the way of the cross.
Oh.
The 14 steps.
Yep.
And being befuddled by it. There's no resurrection here.
Yeah.
What's the problem with this thing? Because in my previous faith, it was only about the resurrection. It wasn't about the 14 steps.
Right.
But here we have this long-standing tradition of these 14 steps of suffering that draw us into that. Was that a part of your own journey, the stages of the cross?
Mm-hmm. Stages of the cross, yeah. And a big part of the journey was, I haven't emphasized this enough, is beauty. And Dostoevsky. We plunge in to Dostoevsky, and it's not a light read. You're really plunged into the soul of man and his questions around that. And his statement that beauty will save the world, well, the beauty of Christ is saving the world. Jesus is saving the world. So the beauty that I see, again, being a visual person, that was enough to draw me. I know the first time I saw a picture of the Pietà, Michelangelo, I could not believe that any human can do that. How could I'm especially young, how can anybody do this? It is so unbelievable. And so that kind of beauty draws. And the Catholic Church is so good at this. Even the icons of Orthodox. Beauty, visual senses. So you go to Mass, pay attention to the beauty around you, the senses that are all engaged in the liturgy. Be prayerful about it and listen. Just listen. Listen to what God says.
I'm kind of amazed. I was about ready to ask you about the Pietà, because that's exactly what came to my mind.
Oh.
In the meditation on the Pietà, Mary, the suffering Mary, holding her son.
Yeah.
I mean, what a meditative, beautiful expression at the core of Catholic spirituality is the Pietà itself.
How can anybody do that?
Yeah.
So it's just meditating on beauty. So you go to Mass, listen. Just listen. Listen to the beauty. Look at the trees that are in your backyard, the stars at night, the beautiful works of art that are continually being made. That which is the deepest part of the human soul, which is an expression of beauty, and wanting that in your heart. I think that's where I would go.
Jerry from New York writes, what are some of the things Dale and his family like best about being Catholic? You've been Catholic a little over a year, right?
Yeah. Well, often I say, being Catholic for over a year, it's kind of like it's the black and white Dorothy who's being caught up in Kansas, right, in a tornado. And she opens the door from black and white into a colorful world of Oz. Different world. Munchkins have kind of a different language. It's colorful. For us, it's the continual discovery of new language, of new tradition, of new everything. What do we like? Well, we like everything. There's nothing we don't like. I like the depth. I like history. I like always attracted to Catholic scholarship. Beauty is what attracts us. Liturgy attracts us. And just the life of being able, the rosary, everything. It's like being in Oz and not wanting to come home.
What about your counseling? Because that's so much a part of both your and your wife's life. How did the Catholic faith, has it affected your perspective on counseling? Yeah,
because of the redemptive. I talk about transfiguration now, that somehow mourning, loss, lamentation, part of who we are, but God transfigures that into an image of His Son. And it's an image on the cross. It's not an empty cross. And it touches, that I think is the core of how it's different. I got to be careful though, because there's some, the prodigal men's group is still ecumenical.
Right.
But people hear that. It's interesting. So I have guys teach from our lessons. That's how you make leaders. And when they teach, they're very close to Catholic theology, without me saying anything. Very close. I think I'll say something next time.
Well, of course, you're young in the faith, and I think another thing that I'm assuming you're going to continue to grow is that one major difference in all these other traditions you were part of in the Catholic Church is the sacramental graces.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's really a whole different aspect of the faith than in all the other traditions.
So why do we go to church? Well, we don't go to church to hear any more preaching. Although homilies are good, and sometimes they're better than others. But why do we go to church? We go to church to meet Jesus. It didn't take us, it took just a small step to believe in the real presence. Just a small step. We go to church to meet Jesus and His people. And every Sunday, this is where Pentecostals and Catholics are so close. We see miracle. That the bread and the wine are transfigured and transformed into Jesus' body. And we partake. Yikes. That's a good reason to go to church. And so, yeah, exactly.
In this continuing miracle of divinization, of experiencing ourselves, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, which Pentecostals, of course, are big into, but understanding this transformation of ourselves into becoming what God intends us to be.
Yeah, it's a rich banquet. It's a rich banquet. We were just, we were doing rice cakes and Melba toast before, but now it's rich for us.
Well, Dale, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us on the journey home again. eighthDayCommunity.org. Eighth with the numeral 8.
Yeah.
eighthDayCommunity.org in case more want to know about you and what you're doing. Thank you, Dale, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I hope Dale's journey has been an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.